Hi everyone, welcome to part 24 of our We Are Called Devotion series. If you missed any of the earlier ones or you want to go back and watch them again, they're all located on my YouTube channel and they're all links on the church's Facebook page, the same place you found this one. So you can go back and you can look at them all. Part 24 we'll look at the prophet Daniel, part 1. This is just chapters 1 to 6 we're going to talk about. So our reading is a whole story from Daniel chapter 2, verses 1 to 49. The story goes, in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar dreamed such dreams that his spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. So the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. When they came in and stood before the king, he said to them, I have had such a dream that my spirit is troubled by the desire to understand it. The Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will reveal the interpretation. The king answered the Chaldeans, This is a public decree. If you do not tell me both the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you do tell me the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation. Well, they answered a second time, Let the king first tell his servants the dream, then we can give its interpretation. The king answered, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see I have firmly decreed, if you do not tell me the dream, there is but one verdict for you. You have agreed to speak lying and misleading words to me until things take a turn. Therefore tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king, There is no one on earth who can reveal what the king demands. In fact, no king, however great and powerful, has ever asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. The thing that the king is asking is too difficult, and no one can reveal it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with mortals. Well, because of this, the king flew into a violent rage and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. The decree was issued, and the wise men were about to be executed, and they looked for Daniel and his companions to execute them. Then Daniel responded with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the king's chief executioner, who had gone out to execute the wise men of Babylon. He asked Arioch, the royal official, Why is the decree of the king so urgent? Arioch then explained the matter to Daniel, so Daniel went in and requested that the king give him time, and he would tell the king the interpretation. Then Daniel went to his home and informed his companions, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions, with the rest of the wise men of Babylon, might not perish. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night, and Daniel blessed the God of heaven. Daniel said, Blessed be the name of God from age to age, for wisdom and power are his. He changes times and seasons, deposes kings, and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and light dwells with him. To you, O God of my ancestors, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and power, and have now revealed to me what we asked of you, for you have revealed to us what the king ordered. Therefore Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon, and said to him, Do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will give the king the interpretation. Then Arioch quickly brought Daniel before the king and said to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who can tell the king the interpretation. The king said to Daniel, whose name was also Belteshazzar, Are you able to tell me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Well, Daniel answered the king, "No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or diviners can show to the king the mystery that the king is asking. But there is a God in heaven who reveals mysteries, and he has disclosed to King Nebuchadnezzar what will happen at the end of your days. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed were these. To you, O king, as you lay in bed came thoughts of what would be hereafter, and the revealer of mysteries disclosed to you what is to be. But as for me, this mystery has not been revealed to me because of any wisdom that I have more than any other living being, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king, and that you may understand the thoughts of your mind. You were looking, O king, and lo, there was a great statue. This statue was huge, its brilliance extraordinary. It was standing before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of that statue was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. As you looked on, a stone was cut out, not by human hands, and it struck the statue on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. Then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold were all broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the statue became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the king of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, the might, and the glory, into whose hand he has given human beings wherever they live, the wild animals of the field and the birds of the air, and whom he has established as ruler over them all. You are the head of gold. After you shall arise another kingdom, inferior to yours, and yet a third kingdom of bronze, which shall rule over the whole earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. Just as iron crushes and smashes everything, it shall crush and shatter all these. As you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the strength of iron shall be in it, as you saw the iron mixed with the clay. As the toes of the feet were part iron and part clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. As you saw the iron mixed with clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. And in the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall this kingdom be left to another people. It shall crush all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever, just as you saw that a stone was cut from the mountain, not by hands, and that it crushed the iron, the bronze, the clay, the silver, and the gold. The great God has informed the king what shall be hereafter. The dream is certain, and its interpretation trustworthy. Well, then Nebuchadnezzar fell on his face, worshipped Daniel, and commanded that a grain offering and incense be offered to him. The king said to Daniel, "Truly your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king promoted Daniel and gave him many great gifts and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon, but Daniel remained at the king's court. Here ends the reading. We'll actually finish our look at the Old Testament prophets, their work, and their calling to us to join in the holy work of bringing God to the world and the world to God with a two-parter, the prophet Daniel. We'll talk about the first part today and the second part next week, and then we'll take a short break as I prepare the next phase of these video devotions. The book of Daniel divides neatly into two sections. The first part, which we'll look at today, is a series of unfortunate events that happened to Daniel and his three friends as they navigate being Jewish in the post-exile world. While some Jews returned to Jerusalem and rebuilt their lives and their city and their temple there, many other Jews remained in this diaspora, living out their lives in the kingdoms and cities where they were. The story of Daniel, like the story of Esther, is a story of Jews surviving and thriving in an often hostile and confusing world. Daniel's story, if you pay attention, actually stretches over hundreds of years, much longer than his personal life could have lasted, but that doesn't matter to the story. This isn't about one person's story, it's about the life that the faithful people will enjoy, endure, and explain to their children. The story starts in Babylon during the exile, when among all the Jews brought into exile came 4 young men who were taken from their people and educated in the Babylonian world to serve in the king's court. Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah were educated and instructed. They had their names changed. They were even instructed on what foods they were now allowed to eat. Everything to take away their culture and their world and make them into Babylonians. But through it all, they remembered their heritage, they kept up with their traditions and their names, they became more trustworthy and wise than any other court official. So they were put in positions of power and authority, we are told, until the first year of King Cyrus, who was the Persian emperor who allowed the people to return home. So Daniel, we are told, remained in power for about 50 years during this exile. But before we get to King Cyrus, Daniel has to survive the Babylonians, which is fraught with risk. This reading comes right away after the introduction. It's the first story of Daniel's miraculous intervention, being able to tell and interpret the king's dream. It's a fascinating story full of twists and turns, and it's not capable of just reading a part of it, which is why I read the whole thing. And it's only one of the many stories. It's set up to remind us of the Joseph story from back in Genesis, that God is still speaking to us, even if we don't recognize God's voice or the means that God is using. God is still calling us to serve God in God's ways to God's ends. And that's the important lesson of this sequence, that God has intentions for our world, and everything and everyone that stands opposed to God will eventually crumble and fail and fall. Our plans and purposes are like clay, trying to support what we think is valuable, but what is truly valuable is God's kingdom. The next story continues this theme. We're told that Nebuchadnezzar made a completely golden statue of himself, because that worked so well in the first dream, right? And it required everyone to worship that statue. Well, Daniel and his 3 friends, of course, refused because they only worshipped God. So Nebuchadnezzar got angry and had the 3 other young men thrown into a furnace of fire. And they survived that through divine intervention and were promoted to greater positions of power in the kingdom. But again, that story is about Nebuchadnezzar's own pride and estimation of his own importance to the world. And sure, back then he was pretty important. But today, hardly anybody's ever heard of him. You probably haven't heard of him until I said his name. You should look him up. It's an interesting and fascinating story, King Nebuchadnezzar. Well, then, the story goes that Nebuchadnezzar had another dream that Daniel had to interpret, but because of all this, eventually Nebuchadnezzar went insane and ended up living out in the fields with the cattle eating grass. And so the kingdom passed on to his son, Belshazzar, who only appears for one story, where at a feast a hand comes and writes a message on a wall that Daniel has to interpret again. Yes, this is where the phrase, the writing on the wall, comes from. And the writing on the wall was that the Babylonian Empire was coming to an end. This is the kingdom of silver from the first prophecy. And that indeed came to pass, so that the next story features Darius, the Persian emperor, who did indeed destroy the Babylonians. And again, Daniel made a name for himself in the Persian Empire and was promoted. But not everyone was happy with that, and a bunch of people set a trap for Daniel. They talked Darius into making a law forbidding anyone to pray to any god or any person except for Darius for a month. Well, when Daniel is caught praying to God like he always did, Darius had him thrown into a pit of lions. But through divine intervention, Daniel was protected through the night. When Darius found out in the morning that Daniel was still alive, he had Daniel taken out of the pit, and all those who accused him thrown in instead. And we are told that Daniel prospered all during the reign of Darius and Darius' son, Cyrus. And that's where the first 6 chapters end. Throughout these stories that make up these first 6 chapters, we are shown that God is invested and involved in the lives of God's people, no matter where they are, always working through these chosen people like Daniel and his friends, like you and I, to make the world and the places where we live a better place. Notice, in none of these stories did Daniel ever think of leaving this foreign land. It's like he took seriously the prophet Jeremiah's command to seek the prosperity of the city where you live, even in exile, because if it prospers, so do you. That's in Jeremiah 29:7, preaching to the exiles like Daniel. This is so far from our modern trap and accusation that we hear all the time of, if you don't like it, leave. Instead, we should be like Daniel and say, if you don't like it, let's work together to fix it and make it better so it's good for all of us. God has put us here in this country, whether we're here by birth, by choice, or by accident, to live and work together so that we can see the foretaste of God's kingdom right here and right now. Next week, we'll finish Daniel and the Old Testament prophets by getting just a glimpse of that kingdom through some fascinating, interesting, and instigating images that show us how we are called and chosen to do God's work. And thanks be to God for that.